Welcome to Mr. Adler's physics class. This is the first in what is hopefully several flipped classroom lessons. What I'm trying to do today is not particular to a certain lesson plan, but this is a lesson that's we're starting with this year because it's stuff we're going to use hopefully the whole year. One of the words we're going to be using a lot, especially in today's lesson when we talk about labs, is objectives. Whoa. We've got three objectives today. The first one is to introduce what flipped classrooms are all about. It would help if I could spell, I'm sure. Once we learn how you can take advantage of these flipped classrooms, these flipped lessons that I'm putting together, we're going to start talking about how we're going to write up labs. And so the second biggest objective of all in this lesson is the format for lab write-ups in Mr. Adler's class. You've probably seen formats from other classes in high school, earth science, bio, chem, or an elective, and they're all pretty close to what I'm going to show you, but they might not be the same. And so this lesson is to show you what I want, which is what I will consider acceptable so that you know what it's supposed to look like. Once we're done talking about the lab in general, one of the parts of a lab is often taking data and making them into taking the data and making it into a graph. And graphs are very important to understand because I think before you leave high school, it's important that you understand it's not just a pretty picture, that there's reasons why we make graphs beyond a presentation of our data. And so we're going to talk about the importance of proper graphs so that you have a better understanding of why I ask you to do things the way I do. So let's get started here and talk about what a flipped classroom is all about. Flipped classrooms are kind of newfangled. They're supposed to turn upside down the typical lesson plans that teachers have been doing for so many years. Sometimes this is good, sometimes it's not, but here's the idea. Most of your learning has been in a classroom with the teacher presenting you a lesson, and then you go home and you practice it with a worksheet, with homework, with stuff like that. It's worked pretty well for quite a while, but we're always up for change because sometimes people work differently. So the idea of a flipped classroom is instead of learning the lesson in class and going home to practice, the idea is you're at home learning a lesson by watching a video, by watching some examples that you should be able to understand on your own. That's my job, to make sure you can do that when you're at home. Then you come into class and you practice that. And why is that better? Because you're practicing it with me in the room. So if you get stuck, you can ask for help as soon as you find out you have trouble, and then I'm there to help you. Whereas if you are at home and you got stuck, you might be out of luck. Okay? So here's what's important. Flipped classrooms. First thing, you're going to learn material at home. And what's great about this is you can pause, rewind, watch partial lessons, lessons, and come back to finish later. That keeps you fresh. We've got three parts to this plan. After this first lesson part, if you're like, wow, that was a lot, I need to think about that, go get a drink, go have a snack, send a selfie to a friend, and then you can come back and still get some of the lessons later on in 10 minutes, 20 minutes, later tonight, something like that. So that's great. You're not under the gun to learn it in the period that I'm teaching it or staying after and stuff like that. You can watch it again if you need to. All sorts of stuff like that. Okay? Then you can come into class. You practice in class with a teacher nearby for help. That's supposed to do some great stuff for you, and hopefully it will. Plus, you always have the opportunity to review the lessons at a later date. I'm sure there's more reasons that the flipped classroom people would say flipped classrooms are great. This is pretty good for me. And this is why we're starting this year by looking at this stuff so that you understand later on, oh wait, we've got another lab coming up. And Mr. Adler's particular about how he wants the lab. I'm going to pay attention. Oh, I forgot. Ooh, I'm going to go back and watch the lesson again. So it's going to be great, right? So now let's talk about what I want from a lab format. And like I said, hopefully it's not very different from what you're used to. First thing is going to be the objective. And when you do the write-up, if you want to write the word objective and underline it and then start writing the objective, that's great. If you just want to start it as a sentence or a paragraph and indent it, that's okay with me. But it's got to be the first part. What's the objective? Okay, the objective is, you're going to answer this, by the way. You're not going to write this down. What are you trying to figure out with the lab? Could be a sentence, could be a few sentences. Usually we're going to talk about it before we start doing the lab. So that's not something that you should freak out and worry, how am I supposed to know? We're going to talk about it. Second part is the procedure. This is your list of steps you took to undertake the lab. Other lab write-ups, I think in chem sometimes, they used to have a materials list as well. Put that in here. Okay? List of steps, by the way. It's not just one step. It's steps. Undertake the lab. And again, if you want to make it a list with bullets, if you just want to make it a bunch of sentences, that's up to you, as long as it's the second part. Then we're going to have data. It might be a data table. It might be a list of data, wow, that you collected. Just make sure it's organized. That's usually what the lab's all about, gathering data. And so you're going to neaten it up and put it in a data table. You don't have to draw lines like columns and stuff like that. If you just organize them and put them neatly together, that's okay with me. I'm not going to return the lab if it doesn't have horizontal and vertical lines separating all the numbers. By the way, sometimes it might be 4 numbers, 3 numbers, and that's it. And that's okay too. Just make sure you're organizing it. Now, I put the next part right here, what we call data analysis. But it might not always be here. Okay? Data analysis, it could be calculations, would go right here. Sometimes, though, it's going to be a graph of the data. If it is a graph, you can staple the graph to the end of the lab. Okay? That's okay. And like I said, we're going to get more into the what a graph's supposed to look like later. I'm actually thinking that I might make that a separate video so that this thing doesn't get too long. But make sure you've shown all your work. Make sure that you've used correct units. You're going to hear me say use correct units throughout the year. Make sure you're double checking that you've got the correct units. And if it's not a graph, make sure it goes right here. Now, we're doing labs to figure stuff out. So the next part, the conclusions, is where you write down what'd you figure out. It might be a formula. It might be some sentences, but right here is where you pick what did you figure out? Oh my goodness, figure out the lab. Then again, like with procedure, we'll probably talk about it, and so you'll have some idea. Here's a warning. A lot of times people go, I figured it out. I know what I'm supposed to write. Bam, I'm done with the lab. Can't wait to turn it in. There's one more part that I don't want you to forget, because this is something the professionals want to make sure you're thinking about. Okay? Errors. Errors are how the lab could have been messed up. You're not admitting that you did mess it up, but what you're admitting is you thought about things that could have messed up the lab and you tried to correct for them. Trying to minimize errors, trying to make sure that you tell people of the future when this lab write-up gets published and you win a Nobel Prize for science, here's what you want to avoid. Okay? What could have gone wrong in the lab? What did you try to keep from messing up the lab? That's really important. Those are the parts of a lab. I am going to stop this video in a minute because it's getting a little long. We're going to talk about graphs in a different video. Probably going to have to watch them both the same night. But this is the way a lab write-up has to look. These parts have to be here in this order. The reason why I'm showing you that, the reason why I'm saying that probably for the 5th time already is a lot of times when we start a lab in class, people start writing stuff down. And we don't always answer all these parts in the right order. And so your notes might not be in the right order. I don't want you just turning in that raggedy piece of notebook paper and going, here's my lab, is that okay? You need to stop and think about what you've done. And I don't mean that in the you broke mom's favorite, dish at home. Think about what you've done and organize it, because this is the way that in the real world science is done, and this is how scientists show we did good work. This is how we figured out stuff for real. We're not just making it up. The whole idea of a lab write-up is to show people what you did and how you did it so that they can do it also. Because we don't believe a scientific discovery unless we can do it too, unless it's repeatable. And by having this set up for a lab, we can repeat the lab. And if we get the same answers, that's when we say, ooh, I think you're onto something. I don't know that we're going to discover anything major this year, but it sets you up to know how to do the correct write-up for when you're getting into the big leagues. All right, that's enough for this lesson. Probably going to have to watch another one pretty quick about the importance of graphs. But for now, make sure you remember that this is around online for you to look at if you forget what a lab write-up's supposed to be.